He survived a war overseas, but it was the quiet judgment of his own country that nearly broke him. The first stone didn't hit hard, but it didn't have to. It rolled to a stop near his boot, a small sound against the cold ground, followed by a laugh that echoed sharper than the wind. Ethan Cole didn't look up. He kept his hands steady on the worn canvas pack slung over his shoulder, guiding it inch by inch toward the dark mouth of the cave carved into the mountainside, his breath slow, controlled, the way it had been trained to be when everything around him felt like it might collapse. Beside him, Rex stood still, ears forward, amber eyes tracking every movement behind them, not with fear, but with a quiet, watchful understanding that had been forged in places far louder than this. The air smelled of pine and distant snow, a thin, metallic chill that clung to the skin and whispered of something coming, though no one in the small settlement below seemed to notice or care. They had gathered along the dirt road that led up the ridge, boots planted firm, jackets pulled tight, watching as if they had paid for a show they couldn't quite believe. A cave, one man muttered, shaking his head, his voice carrying easily through the still air. After everything, that's where he ends up. Another chuckled, softer, almost pitying. Guy thinks he's off the grid or something. That dog deserves better. Ethan heard every word. He always did. But he didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because somewhere along the way, he had learned that some battles weren't worth the breath it took to fight them. Instead, he stepped closer to the cave entrance, the shadow swallowing him halfway, the temperature dropping just enough to raise a faint shiver along his arms beneath the worn jacket. Rex moved with him, silent, deliberate, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg for just a second, a contact so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. It was enough. It always was. A woman's voice rose from behind, sharper now, edged with something less like humor and more like dismissal. You can't just live in a hole like that. Winter's coming. You'll freeze before the first real storm hits. Ethan paused then, not turning, not yet. His hand rested against the rough stone of the cave wall, feeling its solid, unyielding presence beneath his palm, the way it held the cold but also resisted it, like something that had endured far longer than any of them standing out there pretending to understand survival. Slowly, he glanced back over his shoulder, just enough for his eyes to meet theirs for a fraction of a second. There was no anger in them, no plea, just a kind of stillness that made the laughter falter, if only for a moment. "We'll manage," he said, his voice low, even, carrying none of the weight they expected it to. Then he turned away, stepping fully into the cave as the light dimmed around him, the sounds of the outside world softening into something distant, almost irrelevant. Inside, the air shifted. It was colder, yes, but it was also quieter, the kind of quiet that didn't judge, didn't question, didn't remind you of everything you'd lost. He set the pack down carefully, each movement deliberate, as if placing something fragile into a space that might finally hold it without breaking. Rex circled once, then settled near the entrance, not blocking it, not guarding it, just watching, his gaze fixed on the pale sky beyond where the wind had begun to change direction, subtle, but unmistakable. Ethan noticed. He always noticed when Rex did that. He stepped closer, following the dog's line of sight, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the horizon. The clouds had thickened, their edges no longer soft but heavy, layered, moving faster than they should have been for this time of year. The temperature dropped another degree, maybe two. Not enough for the settlers to feel from where they stood down the ridge, still talking, still laughing, their voices now fading into the distance as they turned away one by one, convinced the show was over. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath visible now in the cooling air, and rested his hand briefly on Rex's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured, more to the silence than to the dog. Rex didn't move. Didn't need to. His ears twitched once, his gaze unwavering, fixed on something far beyond what human eyes could measure. Outside, the first faint gust of wind swept across the mountainside, carrying with it a sharper bite, a warning wrapped in something almost invisible. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that ridge, Ethan allowed himself the smallest shift in posture, not fear, not doubt, but readiness, the kind that didn't come from being right, but from having learned the cost of being unprepared. Behind him, the cave held steady. In front of him, the world began to change. The cave did not feel like shelter at first. It felt like memory, like something ancient pressing in from all sides, the stone walls breathing out a cold that settled into bone and thought alike. But Ethan moved through it with quiet intention, unpacking what little he had with the same care he once gave to equipment that determined whether a man lived through the night or did not. A folded wool blanket, a dented metal canteen, a small tin box that held matches wrapped in plastic, and a photograph he did not look at. Not yet, placing each item where it would matter later, not where it looked right now. Because survival was never about comfort, it was about timing, and outside, the wind shifted again, longer this time, threading through the trees with a low, restless sound that made the branches tremble just enough to whisper against one another like a warning no one in the settlement would hear. No one except the dog who remained near the entrance, still as carved wood, his body angled toward the ridge below, his ears catching what the world tried to hide. And when Ethan struck the first match, the flame flared weak and small before steadying, casting a trembling glow across the cave walls, revealing just how deep it went, deeper than it looked from the outside, curving slightly to the right where the rock narrowed the opening and broke the wind's direct path. A natural barrier, not perfect, but enough. Always enough if you understood how to use it, and he crouched near a small circle of stones he had arranged earlier, feeding the flame with dry twigs he had gathered on his way up. Each piece placed deliberately, not rushed, because rushing wasted heat, wasted breath, wasted chances, and Rex finally moved then, not away from the entrance, but a step closer to Ethan, his nails clicking softly against the stone floor before stopping again, his gaze shifting from the horizon to the man. Just for a moment, as if confirming something unspoken, and Ethan nodded once, a habit more than a thought, as though acknowledging an order that had never been spoken aloud. And for a few minutes, there was a kind of fragile peace inside that cave, the fire growing stronger, the warmth pushing back just enough of the cold to make the space feel claimed, inhabited, real. But it did not last, because outside, the sky had begun to lose its color, not fading into evening, but draining into something flatter, heavier, the kind of gray that pressed down instead of opening up, and the wind carried a different sound now, sharper, more insistent, cutting across the ridge in uneven bursts that rattled loose gravel and sent fine dust skittering along the ground. And down below, faint but still visible, the settlers moved about their routines, doors opening and closing, a truck engine starting and stopping. The ordinary rhythm of people who believed the day would end the way it always did. Warm lights, hot meals, walls that kept the outside where it belonged. And Ethan watched them for a moment from the edge of the cave, the fire at his back, the cold at his face, and something in his expression shifted, not regret, not resentment, just recognition, the understanding that people often trusted what had always worked for them, even when the world was already changing. And Rex let out a low breath, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between, something that belonged more to instinct than to sound. And he stepped forward again, placing himself just at the threshold where the first flakes began to fall, so light they almost disappeared before touching the ground. A quiet beginning that did not look like danger, not yet, and Ethan followed his gaze, watching as those flakes multiplied, slowly at first, then with a little more urgency, the wind catching them, turning them sideways, carrying them across the ridge in thin, shifting lines that blurred the distance. Just enough to make the settlement look farther away than it was, and he exhaled again, slower this time, feeling the air tighten in his chest as the temperature dropped another few degrees, subtle but undeniable, and without a word, he reached for the pack again, pulling out an extra layer, thick and worn but reliable, draping it near the fire. To warm before using it, every motion calm, measured, almost ritual, because panic had no place here, not in a space built for endurance. And behind him, the cave held its quiet, steady and unmoved, while in front of him, the first real edge of the storm began to take shape, not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable, like a truth that did not need to announce itself to be real. By the time the light should have softened into evening, it had already vanished, swallowed not by night, but by a thickening veil of white that blurred edges and distances until the world felt smaller, quieter, and somehow more uncertain, and Ethan stood at the cave entrance with his shoulders squared against the rising wind, watching as the flakes grew heavier, faster, no longer drifting but driving sideways in sharp, restless lines that scratched against the rock and hissed across the ground, like something alive. And below, the settlement began to change in ways even the most confident among them could not ignore. Doors that had opened casually now slammed shut with urgency. Figures moved quicker, arms wrapped tight around themselves as they crossed open spaces, and the faint hum of generators flickered on and off as if unsure whether they could keep up with what was coming. And Ethan could almost feel the shift, not just in the air but in the people, that subtle turning point, where certainty gave way to doubt, though pride still held its ground for now, still whispered that this would pass like every other storm had passed before. And behind him, the fire had grown steady, its glow pressing warmth into the stone and into the small space they now occupied. The flicker of light dancing along the uneven walls, reflecting in Rex's eyes as he turned briefly toward it, then back to the storm without hesitation, because whatever comfort existed inside the cave did not outweigh what he sensed outside. And Ethan noticed that too, the way the dog refused to fully settle, the way his breathing stayed measured but alert, like a sentry who knew the night would not be quiet. And for a moment, Ethan closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, not in fear, but in that practiced stillness that allowed him to listen beyond the obvious, beyond the wind, beyond the cold, to the pattern beneath it all. And when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, something quieter, heavier, the recognition that this was no ordinary storm, that this ridge, this cave, this choice he had made without explanation to anyone, might soon mean more than just survival for himself. And the thought lingered only a second before he pushed it aside, because speculation wasted time, and time was already narrowing. And he turned back into the cave, reaching for the canteen, taking a slow drink, the metal cold against his lips, grounding him in the present, in what he could control, while outside the wind rose another notch, its tone deepening, carrying a hollow edge that echoed off the mountainside and returned in uneven waves. And somewhere below, a faint shout cut through the noise, distant, almost lost, but real enough to draw Rex's head sharply toward the sound, his ears locking onto it, body tensing in a way that spoke not of fear but of readiness. And Ethan stepped back to the entrance again, narrowing his gaze through the thickening curtain of snow, trying to locate the source. But the storm had already begun to erase details, turning shapes into shadows, movements into suggestions, and he saw only brief glimpses, a figure stumbling slightly before regaining footing, another shape moving toward a building, a door struggling against the wind before finally giving way, and then it was gone, swallowed by white. And the distance between the cave and the settlement felt longer now, not in miles but in certainty, in the fragile thread that connected safety to assumption. And Rex let out a low, steady sound, not loud, not urgent, but insistent, as if marking the moment. And Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck again, feeling the tension beneath the fur, the strength, the awareness, and he nodded once more, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement of what they both understood without needing to say it. And the temperature dropped again, sharper this time, the kind that bit through layers and settled into joints, and the wind drove the snow harder against the rock, building along the edges of the cave entrance in uneven drifts that began to reshape the opening, narrowing it slightly, changing the way the air moved through. And Ethan stepped forward, adjusting a loose stone near the side, reinforcing the natural barrier just enough to redirect the gusts, small changes that made a difference when the storm decided to test every weakness. And for a brief second, he glanced down at the valley one more time, at the faint, flickering lights that still held on against the growing dark, and there was no judgment in his eyes, no sense of being proven right, only a quiet, steady awareness that the night ahead would not be the same for anyone, not for those in their houses, not for the man in the cave, and certainly not for the dog who had felt it long before the first snow ever touched the ground. And as the storm tightened its grip, the ridge seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the sound of wind, the weight of cold, and the small, unwavering glow of fire behind them, holding its ground against everything else. The wind no longer moved in gusts but in force, a steady, relentless pressure that wrapped around the mountain and pressed inward as if trying to erase everything it touched. And the cave, once quiet and still, began to answer with its own low resonance, a deep, almost hollow sound that carried through the stone like the memory of distant thunder, and Ethan remained near the entrance, one hand braced against the rough wall, feeling the subtle vibrations travel through it, measuring not just the strength of the storm but the way it changed, because change was always the signal, not the noise itself. And Rex stood beside him, closer now than before, his body angled outward, but his weight shifted slightly back, as if balancing between two worlds, the chaos beyond and the fragile order within and outside. The snow had thickened into a wall of white that swallowed depth and direction, turning the ridge into a place without edges, without distance, where even sound struggled to carry. And yet, through it, something broke through again, faint but unmistakable, a voice, or perhaps more than one, strained and uneven, not the casual noise of people going about their day, but something sharper, something that reached instead of spoke. And Rex reacted before the second call fully formed, stepping forward into the narrow threshold where the snow had begun to pile higher, his paws sinking slightly into the fresh layer, his head lifting, ears locked, and Ethan followed without hesitation, his eyes narrowing as he focused into the shifting white, searching not for shapes but for movement, for anything that did not belong to the storm itself. And for a moment, there was nothing, only wind and snow and the steady, growing weight of both. And then, barely visible, a darker outline shifted against the pale backdrop, low to the ground, unsteady, pausing and moving again as if each step had to be chosen carefully. And another shape followed, smaller, closer to it. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition of what that meant, distance collapsing into urgency. And he stepped forward just enough to make himself visible against the cave entrance, raising his arm once, not waving wildly, not shouting, just a clear, deliberate motion that cut through the storm in a way panic never could. And for a second, the shapes hesitated, then angled toward him, their movement uneven but purposeful, and Rex moved again, one step forward, then another, not leaving the boundary of the cave but extending its presence outward, his posture firm, his focus unwavering, as if guiding something unseen along a path only he could sense. And the wind surged harder, driving the snow across the ridge in thicker sheets that stung against exposed skin and blurred what little visibility remained. And Ethan held his ground, counting the seconds between glimpses, measuring distance and instinct rather than sight. And slowly, the figures became clearer. A man bent slightly forward against the wind, one arm wrapped around a smaller form, shielding it as best he could, his steps faltering but refusing to stop, and the child's face remained hidden, pressed into the man's side, small hands clutching tightly. And when they reached the edge of the cave's shelter, the difference was immediate, the wind breaking just enough to allow breath to come easier, to allow sound to exist without being torn apart. And the man looked up, his eyes wide not with fear, but with something closer to disbelief, as if the possibility of reaching this place had not fully formed until now. And for a moment, he said nothing, his breath visible in short, uneven bursts, his shoulders rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. And Ethan did not ask questions, did not demand explanations. He simply stepped back, just one pace, enough to widen the space behind him, enough to make the decision without speaking. And Rex shifted as well, turning slightly, opening the path further, his gaze flicking once from the newcomers to Ethan and back again, confirming what had already been understood. And the man hesitated only a second before stepping inside, guiding the child carefully over the uneven stone, the warmth of the fire reaching them in small, immediate waves. And the child lifted their head just enough to glance at the dog, eyes wide, uncertain, but not afraid. And Rex lowered his head slightly, not submissive, not dominant, simply present, a quiet acknowledgement that this space, once mocked, now held something more than shelter. And outside, the storm did not ease, it intensified, the wind rising another level, the snow thickening into something heavier, more determined, sealing off the ridge piece by piece. and Ethan glanced once more toward the white expanse beyond, knowing without needing to see that this would not be the last time that sound carried through the storm tonight. That the distance between those who had laughed and this narrow opening in the mountain was growing smaller with every passing minute, and he turned back toward the fire, toward the people now inside, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, but beneath it, something had shifted, not in pride, not in validation, but in the quiet acceptance of what the night was becoming, a test not of who was right, but of who would choose what to do when the storm decided for them. The fire grew stronger as more wood caught, its steady crackle filling the space between breaths, between thoughts, between the things no one inside the cave seemed ready to say, and the man who had entered first remained near the edge of the light for a moment, as if unsure whether he truly belonged within it, his shoulders still tense, his hand resting protectively on the child's back, feeling each small movement, each quiet breath, as though confirming they were both still here, still real. And Ethan watched without staring, giving space the way he had learned to do in places where too many words only made things worse. And Rex moved first, not toward the man, not toward the child, but in a slow arc that brought him closer to the fire, his body lowering slightly as he settled, creating a center point, something calm and grounded that did not demand attention but quietly drew it. And the child noticed, their gaze shifting from the flicker of flame to the dog, curiosity pushing gently against fear, and after a second, maybe two, they stepped a little closer, their small boots scraping softly against the stone, the sound fragile in the larger stillness, and the man exhaled, long and slow, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show the weight he had been carrying, not just through the storm, but long before it had ever begun, and he finally spoke, his voice rough but controlled. "I did not think we would make it." The words simple, unadorned, but carrying more truth than anything louder could have held, and Ethan gave a small nod, not agreement, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, because survival did not need commentary, it needed presence. And outside, the storm pressed harder, the wind striking the mountainside with a force that turned the world beyond the cave into something distant and unreachable, and the snow began to build along the entrance in thicker layers, creeping inward a fraction at a time, reshaping the boundary between inside and out, and Ethan moved without hesitation, stepping forward to adjust the stones again, reinforcing the narrow opening, his hands steady despite the cold biting at his fingers, and Rex rose briefly, following him to the edge, his body blocking part of the wind's reach as if by instinct alone, and together they shifted the space just enough to hold back what they could not stop entirely. And when Ethan stepped back, brushing the snow from his sleeves, the man watched him with a different expression now, not disbelief, not judgment, but something quieter, something closer to understanding, and he glanced around the cave, taking in the fire, the careful placement of supplies, the way the space had been shaped not for comfort, but for endurance, and he shook his head once, almost to himself, as if realizing something too late to say aloud, and the child had moved closer to Rex now, their hand hovering for a moment before gently resting against the dog's shoulder, testing, uncertain, and Rex did not pull away, did not react with sudden movement. He simply remained still, his presence steady and warm beneath the small touch, and the child's breath steadied with it, the fear loosening its grip just enough to allow something else to take its place, something softer, something human, and Ethan returned to the fire, adding another piece of wood, watching the flame catch and grow, the light reflecting in his eyes as he sat back on his heels for a moment, listening, always listening, because the storm had not reached its peak yet, not even close, and sure enough, through the howl of wind and the shifting weight of snow, another sound began to form, faint at first, then clearer, another voice, then another, carried unevenly through the storm, not one direction, but several, scattered across the ridge like fragments of a broken line, and Rex's head lifted instantly, his ears turning toward each sound, tracking them not as separate calls, but as a pattern, a map forming where sight could no longer guide, and Ethan felt it too, not the exact location, but the meaning behind it, the realization settling in without resistance, that this cave, this place once dismissed and laughed at, had become something else entirely, something The storm itself had chosen, and he stood slowly, the movement deliberate, measured, his gaze shifting once toward the man, then toward the entrance, and the man met his eyes, understanding passing between them without explanation, a silent question, a silent answer. And for a moment, no one moved, the fire crackling, the wind pressing, the voices distant but growing. And then Rex stepped forward again, stopping at the edge of the entrance, his body angled outward, ready, waiting, and Ethan followed, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving into the moment as it unfolded. Because some choices were not made in comfort or certainty, they were made in the space between what had been and what was coming next. And outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy, only momentum, only the steady, undeniable truth that the night was far from over. The wind no longer sounded like wind, but like something alive pressing against the mountain, a long, low force that bent around the cave and clawed at its edges. And the snow followed with it, thicker now, heavier, driving into every open space it could find, building along the entrance in uneven layers that rose inch by inch, reshaping the world outside into something unrecognizable. And Ethan stood at that narrow threshold again, his figure steady against the shifting white, his eyes scanning, not for clarity, but for movement, for anything that broke the pattern of storm and silence. And beside him, Rex held his ground, muscles coiled beneath his coat, not tense in fear but ready in purpose, his breath slow, controlled, matching the rhythm of the man next to him. And then it came again, clearer this time, a voice carried through the storm, strained and fragmented but closer than before, and another followed, then a third, overlapping, uneven, like people calling out without knowing if anyone could hear them. And Ethan did not hesitate. He stepped forward just enough to make himself visible again, raising his arm once more in that same deliberate motion, a signal not of urgency, but of direction, something steady to move toward in a world that had lost all edges. And Rex moved with him, stepping just beyond the stone lip of the cave, his paws sinking deeper into the snow now, his body cutting a path that held for only seconds before the wind tried to erase it. And through the shifting white, shapes began to form, more than before, two figures at first, then another behind them, moving unevenly, leaning into the wind, their steps uncertain but driven by something stronger than hesitation. And Ethan narrowed his gaze, tracking their approach, adjusting his stance slightly to shield the entrance as much as he could. And when the first of them reached the edge of the cave's protection, the difference was immediate again, the wind breaking, the sound settling, breath returning in sharp, visible bursts, and the man who stumbled in first caught himself against the stone wall, his gloved hand pressing hard as he steadied, his chest rising and falling rapidly, eyes wide with the kind of awareness that comes when certainty has been stripped away. And behind him, a woman followed, her coat dusted white, her hair pulled tight against the cold, her movements slower but determined. And a third figure lingered just outside for a second, turning once as if looking back towards something that no longer existed in the storm, before stepping inside as well. And for a moment, the cave felt smaller, not cramped, but filled with something heavier than bodies, something unspoken that settled into the air between them. And Ethan stepped back again, the same measured motion, making space without making a point of it. And Rex turned slightly, circling once before settling near the center again, his presence anchoring the shifting energy of the room. And no one spoke right away. The fire crackled, the wind roared beyond the stone, and the silence stretched just long enough to carry meaning. Because recognition did not need words, not yet. And the man who had entered first finally looked up, his gaze meeting Ethan's. And for a brief second, something flickered there, something that might have been memory or realization, or the quiet echo of something said earlier that no longer fit the moment. But he did not speak it. He only nodded once, small, restrained, but real. And Ethan returned the nod just as simply, no more, no less. Because this was not about what had been said before, it was about what was happening now. And the woman moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out toward the warmth, her fingers trembling slightly as the heat reached them. And the third figure leaned back against the stone wall, closing their eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion but in relief. The kind that comes when the body finally believes it might hold together a little longer. And Rex watched them all, his gaze moving from one to the other, not judging, not guarding, simply present, as if marking each arrival, each life that had crossed the threshold into this narrow space carved from rock and necessity. And outside, the storm intensified again, the wind rising in pitch, the snow driving harder, sealing over tracks, erasing paths, turning the ridge into something unreachable for anyone who had not already found their way. And Ethan felt the shift in that too, the closing of options, the narrowing of time. And he stepped forward once more, adjusting the stones at the entrance again, reinforcing the barrier as the snow pressed higher, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the cold that bit deeper now. And when he stepped back, he glanced briefly at the growing group inside, then toward Rex, and the dog met his gaze for a fraction of a second. Enough to confirm what neither needed to say, that this was not finished, that the voices carried through the storm would come again, and that each time they did, the choice would remain the same, not easy, not simple, but clear. And as the fire burned steadily behind them and the storm pressed relentlessly beyond, the cave stood between two worlds, no longer just a place to endure the night, but something else entirely, something chosen not by those who had mocked it, but by the moment that demanded more than words ever could. The cave no longer felt like a place hidden from the world. It felt like the center of it, a small, flickering pocket of warmth and breath held together against something vast and indifferent. And inside, the air had changed, not warmer by much, but steadier, shaped now by the quiet rhythm of people who had stopped running and started enduring. And Ethan stood near the entrance once more, though he had not truly left it, his presence anchored between the fire behind him and the storm beyond. His eyes fixed on the shifting white as if reading something written in motion, and Rex remained beside him, closer than before, his shoulder nearly brushing Ethan's leg, the two of them forming a line that did not block the world out, but held it at a distance just enough to make survival possible. And behind them, the others had settled into positions around the fire, not by instruction but by instinct, forming a loose circle that left space open, not crowded, not forced, each person aware in some quiet way that this place was not theirs to claim but to share. And the man who had arrived with the child now sat with his back against the stone wall, the child wrapped in his coat, their small body leaning into him, breathing slower now, steadier, their earlier fears softened by the warmth and by the presence of something they did not fully understand but trusted anyway. And the woman who had come after stood near the edge of the firelight, her hands extended toward the flame, watching it as if it were the only thing that made sense in a night that had stripped everything else away. And for a while, no one spoke, because the storm spoke enough for all of them, its voice pressing constantly against the cave, rising and falling but never leaving. And then, through it, another sound came, not as distant as before, not as uncertain, but closer, more immediate. And Rex reacted instantly, his head lifting, ears turning sharply toward the left side of the ridge, his body shifting. Before the sound had even fully formed into something recognizable, and Ethan followed that movement, turning slightly, narrowing his gaze into the storm. And this time, the shapes appeared faster, not because the storm had eased, but because they were closer, much closer, and he saw them sooner. Two figures at first, then a third just behind, their movements uneven, one of them struggling more than the others, their steps breaking rhythm, slowing, catching, and continuing again. And Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, his boots pressing into the snow that had now risen several inches at the cave's edge, his posture firm, unmistakable against the white. And he raised his arm again, the same motion, the same signal, steady and clear, and Rex moved ahead of him by a single step, just enough to mark the path, his body cutting through the drifting snow, his presence drawing a line where there was none. And the figures saw it, even through the storm, their direction shifting slightly, correcting, moving toward that point of stillness in a world that refused to hold still. And as they reached the cave, one of them stumbled at the edge, their footing lost for a second before catching again, and Ethan moved just enough to close the distance, not pulling, not grabbing, simply placing himself where they could find balance again. And one by one, they crossed into the shelter, breath returning in sharp, visible bursts, their faces pale from the cold, their eyes wide with the quiet shock of having made it through something they had not understood until it was already happening. And inside, the others shifted slightly, making space without being told, the circle widening, the fire receiving new faces without question, and Rex stepped back, returning to his place near the center, his gaze moving briefly across each person before settling again, not counting, not judging, simply acknowledging. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer at the entrance, looking out into the storm that had now erased nearly everything beyond a few yards, the ridge gone, the settlement gone, the world reduced to wind and white, and the thin line where it met the cave. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and then he turned back inside, not with relief, not with pride, but with the quiet understanding that the night had shifted fully now, that what had begun as survival had become something else. Something shared, something chosen again and again with each voice that carried through the storm. And as the fire burned steadily and the cave held its ground against the relentless wind, the space between strangers grew smaller, not through words, but through the simple act of being there, together, while everything else fell away. Time no longer moved in minutes, but in breaths, in the slow rise and fall of chests gathered around a single fire that refused to give up. And inside the cave, the air had grown warmer, not just from the flame, but from the quiet presence of lives pressed together by something none of them could control. And Ethan remained near the entrance, though now he stood slightly turned inward, no longer watching only the storm but the people it had driven here, his gaze steady, unreadable, yet softer at the edges than before. And Rex lay stretched along the boundary between the firelight and the shadow, his body relaxed but never fully at rest, his ears still catching the subtle changes in the wind outside, the faint shifts in sound that others could not hear. And the child who had first entered now sat closer to him, their small hand resting against his fur with more certainty than before, fingers gently tracing the thick coat as if grounding themselves in something real, something alive. And Rex did not move away. He simply breathed, slow and even, offering the kind of reassurance that did not need explanation. And across the fire, the others had settled into a fragile stillness, their earlier tension replaced by a quiet awareness of where they were and what had brought them here. And one of the men, the same one whose voice had once carried laughter up the ridge earlier that day, now sat with his hands wrapped around a tin cup Ethan had passed him without a word, the warmth seeping into his fingers as he stared into the flame, his expression distant, not lost, but searching for something that no longer fit the way it used to. And the woman who had stood at the edge of the fire earlier had now lowered herself to sit, her back against the stone, her shoulders finally dropping as the weight of the storm eased just enough inside this space to allow her to breathe without resistance. And no one spoke of what had been said before. No one mentioned the cave or the choices that had led each of them here, because the storm had already done something words could not. It had removed the distance between them, stripped away the comfort of judgment, and left only what mattered now. And Ethan moved quietly to the fire, adding another piece of wood, the flame rising in response, steady and sure, its light touching every face in turn, revealing not weakness, not regret, but something closer to humility, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And for a moment, he paused, his hand resting near the warmth, his eyes lifting toward the cave opening where the storm still raged beyond, though its sound had shifted slightly, less sharp, more distant, as if it had spent much of its force and now moved on to somewhere else. And Rex noticed that too, his head lifting just slightly, ears turning, the tension in his body easing by a fraction. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement of the change. And he glanced once around the cave, at the circle that had formed without intention, at the quiet connection that had taken root in the absence of anything else. And then he stepped back, returning to his place near the entrance, not to guard it, not to control it, but simply to be there, to hold the line between what remained outside and what had been chosen within. And as the fire continued to burn and the storm began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its grip, the cave no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like something earned, something shared, and in that quiet space, without apology, without declaration, something shifted that none of them would forget. not because it was spoken, but because it was lived. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost cautiously, like something unsure it was welcome after the long, relentless night. And the first sign was not light but silence, the kind that settled where the wind had been, replacing its constant pressure with a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar. And Ethan noticed it before he opened his eyes fully, his body already aware of the change. The absence of force against the cave walls, the absence of that low, endless sound that had filled every space for hours. And when he looked toward the entrance, the white beyond it no longer moved in violent streaks, but rested in soft layers, thick and quiet, covering the ridge like a blanket that had finally decided to stay still. And Rex lifted his head at the same moment, his ears turning once, then relaxing, the tension that had held him through the night easing in a way that did not need explanation. And inside the cave, the others stirred slowly, one by one, as if waking from something deeper than sleep, their movements careful, measured, not out of fear, but out of a quiet awareness that something had changed. And the child sat up first, their hands still resting against Rex's side, fingers tightening slightly before relaxing again as they looked toward the cave opening, their eyes adjusting to the softer light filtering in. And the man beside them followed, his breath steady now, his shoulders no longer held tight against an invisible weight. And across the fire, the others shifted, glancing toward the entrance, then toward Ethan, not seeking permission, not asking what came next, but acknowledging the space he had held through the night, the line he had stood without question. And Ethan rose without a word, stepping toward the cave entrance, his boots pressing into the packed snow that had built up along the threshold. And as he reached the edge, he paused for a moment, taking in the view that had returned, the ridge reappearing in softened shapes, the settlement below, partially buried but intact, roofs carrying thick layers of snow, paths erased and waiting to be made again. And he exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold morning air, not in relief, but in recognition. And behind him, the others began to stand, moving closer to the entrance, drawn by the quiet pull of the outside world now that it had calmed. And they stopped a few feet behind him, not crowding, not rushing past, simply looking, seeing what remained, what had endured, and what had changed. And no one spoke of the night, not yet, because some things needed to settle before they could be named. And Rex stepped forward then, moving past Ethan by a single pace, his paws pressing into the fresh snow, testing it, his body framed against the pale light. And he looked back once, just briefly, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's. And in that moment, something passed between them, something quiet and complete. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, the kind that did not signal an end, but an understanding. And the child stepped closer too, their small boots leaving shallow prints beside the dog's larger ones, their gaze fixed on the world ahead with a mixture of wonder and something deeper, something learned without being taught. And the man who had once laughed stood just behind them, his hands at his sides, his posture different now, not smaller, not broken, but steadier in a way that did not rely on being right. And after a long moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn scarf, the fabric simple, nothing remarkable. And he stepped forward, hesitating only briefly before draping it gently around Rex's neck, his hands careful, almost reverent. And he did not say anything, not an apology, not a thank you, because neither would have carried what needed to be understood. And Rex remained still, accepting the gesture without movement, without demand, simply present as he had been through it all. And Ethan watched this quietly, his expression unchanged, yet softer in a way that only those who had seen him before would have noticed. And as the sun rose higher, casting a pale, steady light across the snow-covered ridge, the cave behind them remained open, not as a place to hide, but as something that had held its ground when everything else had fallen away. And the people who had once stood apart now stood together in its quiet shadow, not bound by words, not by promises, but by a single night that had asked something of them and received an answer. And as they began, slowly, to step forward into the new morning, leaving fresh tracks where none had existed before, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying something that would remain long after the snow had melted, something that did not need to be spoken to be remembered.